So, chapter 2, we have always lived in the castle. All right, I had to put down my shopping bag to open the lock on the gate. It was a simple padlock, and any child could have broken it. And on the gate, there was a sign saying private, no trespassing, and no one could go past that. Our father had put up the signs and the gates and the locks when he closed off the path, before everyone used the path as a shortcut from the village to the highway 4 corners, where the bus stopped. It saved them perhaps a quarter of a mile to use our path and walk past our front door. Our mother disliked the sight of anyone who wanted to walking past our front door. And when our father brought her to live in the Blackwood house, one of the first things he had to do was close off the path and the fence and the entire Blackwood property, from the highway to the creek. There was another gate at the other end of the path, although I rarely went that way. And that gate had a padlock and a sign saying private, no trespassing. The highway's built for common people, our mother said, and our front door is private. Anyone who came to see us, properly invited, came up the main drive which led straight from the gate post on the highway open to the front or up to the front door. When I was small, I used to lie in my bedroom on the back of the house and imagine the driveway and the path as a crossroad meeting before our front door, and up and down the driveway went the good people, the clean, the rich ones dressed in satin and laced, who came rightfully to visit, and back and forth along the path, sneaking and weaving and sidestepping swervedly, went the people from the village. They can't get in. I used to tell myself over and over, lying in the dark room with the plants patterned, or with the trees patterned in shadows on the ceilings. They can't ever get in anymore. The path is closed forever. Sometimes I stood inside the fence, hidden by the bushes, and watched people walking on the highway to get in from the village to the 4 corners. As far as I knew, no one from the village had ever tried to use the path since our father locked the gates. When I had moved the shopping bag inside, I carefully locked the gate again. I tested the padlock to make sure it held. Once the padlock was securely fastened behind me, I was safe. The path was dark because once our father had given up any idea of putting his land to profitable use. He had let the trees and bushes and small flowers grow as they chose. And except for one great meadow and the gardens, our land was heavily wooded, and no one knew its secret ways but me. When I went along the path, going easily now because I was home, I knew each step and every turn. Constance could put names to all growing things, but I was content to know them by their way and the place of growing, and their unfailing offers to refuge. The only prints on the path were my own, going in and out of the village. Past the turn, I might find a mark of Constance's foot. Because she sometimes said that far to wait for me. And most of Constance's prints were in the garden and in the house. Today she had come to the end of the garden, and I saw her as Constance's prints were as soon as I came around the turn. She was standing with the house behind her in the sunlight, and I ran to meet her. "Mary Cat," she said, smiling at me. "Look how far I've come today." "It's too far," I said. "First thing I know, you'll be following me into the village." "I might at that," she said. Even though I knew she was teasing me, I was chilled. But I laughed. You wouldn't like it much," I told her. "Here, Lazy, take some of these packages. Where's my cat?" "He went off chasing butterflies because you were late. Did you remember eggs? I forgot to tell you." "Of course. Let's have lunch on the lawn." When I was small, I thought Constance was a fairy princess. I used to draw her picture with long golden hair and eyes as blue as a crayon could make them, and bright pink spots on either cheek, and pictures always surprised me because she did look like that. Even at the worst times, she was pink and white and golden, and nothing had ever seemed to dim the brightness of her. She was the most precious person in my world, always. I followed her across the soft grass, past the flowers, and tended into my house. And Jonas, my cat, came out of the flowers and followed me. Constance waited inside the tall front door while I came up the steps behind her, and then I put my packages down on the table in the hall and locked the door. We would not use it again until afternoon because almost all of our life was lived towards the back of the house, on the lawn and the garden where no one else ever came. We left the front of the house turned towards the highway in the village and went on our own ways behind its stern, unwelcoming face. Although we kept the house well, the rooms was used together were the back ones. The kitchen and the back bedrooms and the little warm room off the kitchen where Uncle Julian lived. Outside was Constance's chestnut tree and the wide, lovely reach of the lawn and Constance's flowers, and then beyond the vegetable garden Constance tended and passed out the trees which shaded the creek. When we sat on the back of the lawn, no one could see us from anywhere. I remember that I was to be kinder to Uncle Julian when I saw him sitting at his great desk in the kitchen corner playing with his papers. "Will you let Uncle Julian have peanut brittle?" I asked Constance. After his lunch, Constance said. She took the groceries carefully from the bags. Food of all kinds was precious to Constance. She always touched foodstuffs with quiet respect. I was not allowed to help. I was not allowed to prepare food, nor was I allowed to gather mushrooms, although I sometimes carried vegetables in and from the garden or apples from the old trees. "We'll have muffins," Constance said, almost singing because she was sorting and putting away food. "Uncle Julian will have an egg, done soft and buttery, and a muffin, and a little pudding." "Pap," said Uncle Julian. "Mary Cat will have something lean and rich and salty." "Jonas will catch me a mouse," I said to my cat on my knee. "I'm always so happy when you come home from the village," Constance said. She stopped to look and smile at me, partly because you bring home food, of course, but partly because I miss you. "I'm always happy to get home from the village," I told her. "Was it very bad?" She touched my cheek quickly with one finger. "You don't want to know about it. Someday I'll go." It was the second time she had spoken of going outside, and I was chilled. "Constance," Uncle Julian said. He lifted a small scrap of paper from his desk and studied it, frowning. Do not seem to have any information on whether your father took his cigar in the garden as usual that morning." "I'm sure he did," Constance said. "That cat's been fishing in the creek," she told me. "He came in all mud." She folded the grocery bag and put it with the others in the drawer and set the library books on the shelf where they were going to stay forever. Jonas and I were expected to stay in our corner out of the way while Constance worked in the kitchen, and it was a joy to watch her moving beautifully in the sunlight, touching food so softly. "It's Helen Clark's day," I said. "Are you frightened?" She turned to smile at me. "Not a bit," she said. "I'm getting better all the time, I think, and today I'm going to make little rum cakes. And Helen Clark will scream and gobble them." Even now, Constance and I still saw some small society, visiting acquaintances who drove up the driveway to call. Helen Clark took her tea with us on Fridays. Mrs. Shepherd or Mrs. Rice or Mrs. Crawley stopped by occasionally on a Sunday after church to tell us we would have enjoyed the sermon. They came dutifully, although we never returned their calls, and stayed a proper few minutes and sometimes brought flowers from their gardens or books or a song that Constance might care to try over on her harp. They spoke politely and with little runs of laughter, and never failed to invite us to their homes, although they knew we would never come. They were civil to Uncle Julian and patient with his talk. They offered to take us for drives in their cars. They referred to themselves as our friends. Constance and I always spoke well of them to each other, because they believed that their visits brought us pleasure. They never walked on the path. If Constance offered them a cutting from the rose bush or invited them to come see a happy new arrangement of colors, they went into the garden, but they never offered to step beyond their defined areas. They walked along the garden and got into their cars by the front door and drove away down the driveway and out through the big gates. Several times Mr. and Mrs. Carrington came to see how things were getting along, because Mrs. Carrington had been a very good friend of our father's. They never came inside or took any refreshment, but they drove to the front steps and sat in their cars and talked for a few minutes. "How are you getting along?" they always asked, looking from Constance to me and back. "How are you managing all by yourselves? Is there anything you need? Anything we can do? How are you getting along?" Constance always invited them in because we had been brought up to believe that it was discourteous to keep guests talking outside. But Carringtons never came into the house. "I wonder," I said, thinking about them, "whether the Carringtons would bring me a horse if I asked them. I could ride it in the long meadow." Constance turned and looked at me for a minute, frowning a little. "You will not ask them," she said at last. "You could not ask from anyone. Remember that." "I was teasing," I said, and she smiled again. "I only really want a winged horse anyway. We could fly you to the moon and back, and my horse and I." "I remember when you used to want a griffin," she said. "Now, Miss Idleness, run out and set the table." "They quarreled hatefully that last night," Uncle Julian said. "I won't have it," she said. "I won't stand for it, John Blackwood." "And you have no choice," he said. "I listened at the door, of course, but came too late to hear what they quarreled about. I suppose it was money." "They didn't often quarrel," Constance said. "They were almost invariably civil to each other, niece, if that is what you mean by not quarreling. The most unsatisfactory example for the rest of us. My wife and I prefer to shout." "It hardly seems like 6 years sometimes," Constance said. I took the yellow tablecloth and went outside to the lawn and started the table. Behind me, I heard her saying to Uncle Julian, "Sometimes I feel I would give anything to have them all back." When I was a child, I used to believe that someday I would grow up and be tall enough to touch the tops of the windows in our mother's drawing room. There were summer windows, because the house was really intended to be a summer house, and our father had only put in a heating system because there was no other house in our family to move to in the winters. By rights, we should all have the Rochester house in the village, but that was long lost to us. The windows in the drawing room of our house reached from the floor to the ceiling, and I could never touch the top. Our mother used to tell visitors that the light blue silk drapes on the windows had been made up 14 feet long. And there were 2 tall windows in the drawing room, and 2 tall windows in the dining room across the hall. And from the outside they looked narrow and thin, and gave the house a gaunt, high look. Inside, however, the drawing room was lovely. Our mother had brought golden-legged chairs from the Rochester house, and her harp was here, and the room shone in reflections from mirrors and sparkling glasses. Constance and I only had used the room when Helen Clark came for tea, but we kept it perfectly. Constance stood on her stepladder to wash the tops of the windows, and we dusted the Dresden figurines on the mantel, and with a cloth on the end of the broom, we went around the webbing caked trim at the tops of the walls, staring up at the white fruit and leaves, brushing away at Cupid and ribbons knots, dizzy always from looking up and walking backwards, and laughing at Constance when she caught me. We polished the floors and mended tiny tears in the rose brocade of the sofas and chairs. When there was a golden valance over each high window, and golden scroll work around the fireplace, and our mother's portrait hung in the drawing room. "I can't bear to see my lovely room untidy," my mother used to say. And so Constance and I had never been allowed in here. But now we keep it shiny and silky. Our mother had always served tea to her friends from a low table at one side of the fireplace, so that was where Constance always set her table. She sat on the rose sofa with our mother's portrait looking down on her, and I sat in the small chair in the corner and watched. I was allowed to carry cups and saucers and pass sandwiches and cakes, but not pour the tea. I disliked eating anything while people were looking at me, so I had my tea afterwards in the kitchen. That day, which was the last time Helen Clark ever came for tea, Constance had set the table, as usual, with the lovely thin rose-colored cups our mother had always used, and 2 silver dishes, one with small sandwiches, and one with very special rum cakes. 2 rum cakes were waiting for me in the kitchen, in case Helen Clark ate all of these. Constance sat quietly on the sofa. She never fidgeted, and her hands were neatly in her lap. I waited by the window, watching for Helen Clark, who was always precisely on time. "Are you frightened?" I asked Constance once, and she said, "No, not at all." Without turning, I could hear her voice, but she was quiet. I saw the car turn into the driveway and then saw that there were two people in it instead of one. Constance, I said. She brought somebody else. Constance was still for a minute, and then she said quite firmly, I think it will be all right. I turned to look at her, and she was quiet. I'll send them away, I said. She knows better than this. No, Constance said. I really think it'll be all right. You watch me. But I won't have you frightened. Sooner or later, she said, sooner or later, I will have to take a first step. I was chilled. I want to send them away. No, Constance said, absolutely not. The car stopped in front of the house, and I went into the hall to open the front door, which I had unlocked earlier because it was not courteous to unlock the door in a guest's face. When I came onto the porch, I saw that it was not quite as bad as I had expected. It was not a stranger Helen Clark had with her, but little Mrs. Wright, who had come once before and had been more frightened than anyone else. She would not be too much for Constance, but Helen Clark ought not to have brought her without telling me. Good afternoon, Mary Catherine, Helen Clark said, coming around the car and to the steps. Isn't this a lovely spring day? How is dear Constance? I brought Lucille. She was going to handle it brazenly, as though people brought almost strangers every day to see Constance, and I disliked having to smile at her. You remember Lucille Wright? She asked me, and poor little Mrs. Wright said in a small voice that she had so wanted to come again. I held the front door open, and they came into the hall. They had not worn coats, because it was such a fine day. But Helen Clark had the common sense to delay a minute away. Tell Constance we've come, she said to me, and I knew she was giving me time to tell Constance who was here, so I slipped into the drawing room where Constance sat quietly, and I said, Mrs. Wright, the frightened one. Constance smiled. Kind of a weak first step, she said. It's going to be fine, Mary Cat. In the hall, Helen Clark was showing off the staircase to Mrs. Wright, telling the familiar story about the carving and the wood brought from Italy. When I came out of the drawing room, she glanced at me and said, This staircase is one of the wonders of the county. Mary Catherine, shame to keep it hidden from the world. Lucille? They moved into the drawing room. Constance was perfectly composed. She rose and smiled, and she said she was glad to see them. Because Helen Clark was ungraceful by nature, she managed to make a simple act of moving into a room and sitting down a complex ballet for 3 people. Because Constance had quite finished speaking, Helen Clark jostled Mrs. Wright and sent Mrs. Wright sideways into a careening croquet ball off of the far corner of the room, where she sat abruptly and clearly without intention upon a small and uncomfortable chair. Helen Clark made for the sofa where Constance sat, nearly upsetting the tea table, and although there were enough chairs in the room and another sofa, she sat finally uncomfortably close to Constance, who detested having anyone near her but me. Now, Helen Clark said, spreading, it's good to see you again. So kind of you to have us. Heirs, Wright said, leaning forward. Such a lovely staircase. You look well, Constance. Have you been working in the garden? I couldn't help it on a day like this, Constance laughed. And she was doing very well. It was so exciting, she said across to Mrs. Wright. Perhaps you're a gardener too. These first bright days are so exciting for a gardener. She was looking a little too much and a little too fast, but no one noticed except me. I do love a garden, Mrs. Wright said in a little burst. I do so love a garden. How's Julian? Helen Clark asked before Mrs. Wright had quite finished speaking. How old is Julian? Very well, thank you. He's expecting to join us for a cup of tea this afternoon. Have you met Julian Blackwood? Helen Clark asked Mrs. Wright, and Mrs. Wright, shaking her head, began, I would love to meet him, of course. I've heard so much, and stopped. He's a touch eccentric, Helen Clark said, smiling at Constance as though it had been a secret until now. I was thinking that if centric meant, as the dictionary said it did, deviating from regularity, that Helen Clark was far more eccentric than Uncle Julian, with her awkward movements and unexpected questions and her bringing strangers here to tea. Uncle Julian lived smoothly and in a perfectly planned pattern, rounded and sleek. She ought not to call people things they're not, I thought, remembering that I was to be kinder to Uncle Julian. Constance, you've always been one of my closest friends, she was saying now, and I wondered at her. She really could not see how Constance withdrew from such words. I was going to give you a word of advice, and remember, it comes from a friend. I must have known what she was going to say because I was chilled. All this day has been building up to what Helen Clark was going to say right now. I sat low in my chair and looked hard at Constance, waiting for her to get up and running away, wanting her to not hear what was about to be said. But Helen Clark went on, "It's spring. You're young, you're lovely, you have the right to be happy. Come back to the world." Once, even a month ago when it was still winter, words like this would have made Constance draw back and run away. Now I saw that she was listening and smiling, and although she shook her head. "You've done you've done pittance enough," Helen Clark said. "I would so like to give a little luncheon," Mrs. Wright began. "You've forgotten the milk. I'll get it." I stood up and spoke directly to Constance, and she looked around um, at me almost surprised. "Thank you, dear," she said. I went out of the drawing room and into the hall and started towards the kitchen. This morning the kitchen had been bright and happy, and now, chilled, I saw it was dreary. Constance had looked as though suddenly, after all this time refusing and denying, she had come to see that it may be possible after all to go outside. I realized now that this was the third time in one day that the subject had been touched. 3 times makes it real. I could not breathe. I was tied with wire. My head was huge and going to explode. I ran to the back door and opened it to breathe. I wanted to run. If I could have run to the end of our land and back, I would be all right. But Constance was alone with them in the drawing room, and I had to hurry back. I had to content myself with smashing the milk pitcher which waited on the table. It had been our mother's, and I left the pieces on the floor so Constance would see them. I took down the second best milk pitcher, which would not match the cups. I was allowed to pour milk, and so I filled it and took it to the drawing room. "Do with Mary Catherine," Constance was saying, and then she turned and smiled at me in the doorway. "Thank you, dear," she said, and glanced at the milk pitcher and at me. "Thank you," she said again, and I put the pitcher down on the tray. "Not too much at first," Helen Clark said. "That would look odd, I grant you. But a call or two to an old friend, perhaps a day in the city shopping. No one would recognize you in the city, you know." "A little luncheon," Mrs. Wright said hopefully. "I'll have to think," Constance said, laughing, a little laughing, bewildered gesture. Helen Clark nodded. "You'll need some clothes," she said. I came from my plate in the corner to make tea from Constance, to take a cup of tea from Constance and carry it over to Mrs. Wright, whose hand trembled when she took it. "Thank you, my dear," she said. I could see the tea trembling in the cup, and it was only her second visit here after all. "Sugar?" I asked her. I couldn't help it, and besides it was polite. "Oh, no," she said. "No, thank you. No sugar." I thought, looking at her, that she was dressed to come here today. Constance and I never wore black, but Mrs. Wright had perhaps thought it was appropriate. And today she wore a plain black dress with a necklace of pearls. She had worn black the other time, too, I recalled, although in good taste, I thought, except in my mother's drawing room. I went back to Constance and took up the plate of rum cakes and brought them to Mrs. Wright. That was not kind either. And she would have had the sandwiches first, but I wanted to make her unhappy, dressed in black in my mother's drawing room. "My sister made these this morning," I said. "Thank you," she said. Her hand hesitated over the plate, and then she took a rum cake and set it carefully on the edge of the saucer. I thought that Mrs. Wright was being almost hysterically polite, and I said, "Do take two. Everything my sister cooks is delicious." "No," she said. "Oh, no, thank you." Helen Clark was eating sandwiches, reaching down past Constance to take one after another. She wouldn't behave like this anywhere else, I thought, only here. She never cares what Constance thinks or what I think of her manners. She only supposes we are so very glad to see her. "Go away," I told her in my mind. "Go away, go away." I wondered if Helen Clark saved particular costumes for her visits to our house. "This," I could imagine her saying, turning around in the closet. "No sense in throwing this away. I can keep this from visiting dear Constance." I began dressing Helen Clark in my mind, putting her in a bathing suit on the snowbank, setting her high on the hard branches of a tree, and a dress of flimsy pink ruffles, and caught and pulled and tore. She was tangled in the tree and screaming, and I almost laughed. Why not ask some people here? Helen Clark was saying to Constance. A few friends. There are many people who would have wanted to keep in touch with you, Constance dear. A few old friends some evening for dinner? No, she said, perhaps not a dinner. Perhaps not at first. I myself, Mrs. Wright began again, said as she set her cup of tea and little rum cake carefully on the table next to her. Although, why not for dinner? Helen Clark said. You have not taken the plunge some. After all, you have to take the plunge sometime. I was going to have to say something. Constance was not looking at me, but only at Helen Clark. Why not invite some good people from the village? I asked loudly. Good heavens, Mary Catherine, Helen Clark said. You really startled me. She laughed. I don't recall that the Blackwoods ever mingled socially with the villagers, she said. They hate us, I said. I don't listen to their gossip, and I hope you don't. And Mary Catherine, you know as well as I do that 9/10 of that feelings is nothing but your imagination. And if you go halfway to be friendly, there'd never be a word against you. Good heavens, I grant you there might be a little feeling once, but on your side, it's just been exaggerated out of all proportion. People will gossip, Mrs. Wright said assuringly. I've been saying right along that I was a close friend of the Blackwoods and not the least bit ashamed of it either. You might come to people of your own kind, Constance. They don't talk about us. I wish that they would be more amusing. I thought that now Constance was looking a little tired, and if they would leave soon, I would brush Constance's hair until she fell asleep. Uncle Julian is coming, I said to Constance. I could hear the soft sounds of the wheeled chair in the hall, and I got up to open the door. Helen Clark said, Do you suppose that people would really be afraid to visit here? And Uncle Julian stopped in the doorway. He had put on his dandiest tie for company at tea and washed his face until it was pink. Afraid? He said. To visit here? He bowed to Mrs. Wright from his chair and then to Helen Clark. Madam, he said, and Madam. I knew that he couldn't remember either of their names or whether he had seen them before. You look well, Julian, Helen Clark said. Afraid to visit here. I apologize for repeating your words, madam, but I'm astonished. My niece, after all, was acquitted of murder. There could be no possible danger in visiting here now. Mrs. Wright made a little convulsive gesture towards her cup of tea and then sat her hands firmly in her lap. It could be said that there's danger everywhere, Uncle Julian said. Danger of poison, certainly. My niece can tell you the most unlikely perils. Garden plants more deadly than snakes, and simple herbs that slash like knives through the lining of your belly, madam. My niece is such a lovely garden, Mrs. Wright said earnestly to Constance. I'm not sure I know how you do it. Helen Clark said firmly, Now that's all been forgotten long ago, Julian. No one ever thinks about it anymore. Regrettable, Uncle Julian said. A most fascinating case. One of the few genuine mysteries of our time. Of my time, particularly. My life's work, he had told Mrs. Wright. Julian, Helen Clark said quickly, and Mrs. Wright seemed mesmerized. There is such thing as good taste, Julian. Taste, madam? Have you ever tasted arsenic? I assure you that there is one moment of utter incredulity before the mind can accept. A moment ago, poor little Mrs. Wright would probably have bitten her tongue out before she mentioned the subject, and now she said, hardly breathing, You mean you remember? Remember, Uncle Julian sighed, shaking his head happily. Perhaps, he said with eagerness. Perhaps you're not familiar with the story. Perhaps I might. Julian, Helen Clark said. Lucille does not want to hear it. You should be ashamed to ask her. I thought that Mrs. Wright very much did want to hear it, and I looked at Constance just as she glanced at me. We were both very sober to the subject. But I knew that she was full of merriment. I knew she was as full of merriment as I. It was good to hear Uncle Julian, who was so lonely most of the time. And poor Mrs. Wright, tempted at last beyond endurance, was not able to hold it back any longer. She blushed deeply and faltered, and Uncle Julian was a tempter. Mrs. Wright's human discipline could not resist forever. It happened right here in this house, she said, like a prayer. We were all silent, regarding her courteously, and she whispered, I do beg your pardon. Naturally, in this house, Constance said, in the dining room. We were having dinner. A family gathered for the evening meal, Uncle Julian said, caressing his words, never supposing it would be the last. Arsenic in the sugar? Mrs. Rice said, carried away, hopelessly lost all decorum. I used that sugar. Uncle Julian shook his finger at her. I used that sugar myself on my blackberries, luckily. He smiled blandly. Fate intervened. Some of us that day she led inexorably through the gates of death. Some of us innocent and expecting took unwillingly that one last step to oblivion. Some of us took very little sugar. I never touched the berries, Constance said. She looked directly at Mrs. Wright and said soberly, I rarely take sugar on anything, even now. I counted strongly against her at the trial, Uncle Julian said, that she used no sugar, I mean. But my niece has never cared for berries. Even as a child, it was her custom to refuse berries. Please, Helen Clark said loudly. It's outrageous. It really is. I can't bear to hear it talked about. Constance, Julian, what will Lucille think of you? No, really, Mrs. Wright said, lifting her hands. I won't sit here and listen to another word, Helen Clark said. Constance, you must start thinking about the future. This dwelling on the past is not wholesome. The poor little darling has suffered enough. Well, I miss them all, of course, Constance said. Things have been much different with all of them gone, but I'm sure I don't think of myself as suffering. In some ways, Uncle Julian sailed on, a piece of extraordinarily good fortune for me. I'm the survivor of the most sensational poisoning case of the century. I have all the newspaper clippings. I knew the victims, the accused, intimately, as only a relative living in the very house could know them. I have exhausted notes on all that have happened. I've never been well since. I said I didn't want to talk about it, Helen Clark said. Uncle Julian stopped. He looked at Helen Clark and then at Constance. Didn't it really happen? He asked after a minute, fingers at his mouth. Of course it happened. Constance smiled at him. I have the newspaper clippings, Uncle Julian said certainly. I have my notes, he told Helen Clark. I have written down everything. It was a terrible thing. Mrs. Wright was leaning forward earnestly, and Uncle Julian turned to her. Dreadful, he agreed. Frightful, madam. He maneuvered his wheelchair so the back was to Helen Clark. Would you like to view the dining room? He asked. The fateful board. I did not give the evidence at trial, you understand. My health was not equal then or now to rude questions of strangers. He gave a little flick of his head to Helen Clark's direction. I wanted badly to take the witness stand. I falter myself that I would not have appeared to disadvantage, but of course she was acquitted after all. Certainly she was acquitted, Helen Clark said vehemently. She reached for her huge pocketbook and took it into her lap and felt in it for her gloves. No one ever thinks about this anymore. She caught Mrs. Wright's eyes and prepared her eyes. The dining room? Mrs. Wright said timidly. Just a glance. Madam, Uncle Julian contrived a bow from his wheelchair, and Mrs. Wright hurried to reach the door and open it for him. Directly across the hall, Uncle Julian said, and she followed. I admired a decently curious woman, madam. I could see at once that you were devoured with a passion to view the scene of a tragedy. And it happened in this very room. We all still have our dinner in here, every night. We could hear him clearly. He was apparently moving around our dining room table, while Mrs. Wright watched him from the doorway. You will perceive that our table is round. It is overlarge now for the pitiful remnant of our family, and we have been reluctant to disturb what is, after all, a monument of sorts. And at one time, a picture of this room would have commanded a large price from any of the newspapers. We're a large family, once you recall, a large and happy family. We had small disagreements, of course. We were not all of us overblessed with patience. I might almost say that there were quarrels. Nothing serious. Husband and wife, brother and sister did not always see eye to eye. Then why did she? Yes, Uncle Julian said. That is perplexing, is it not? My brother, as head of the family, sat naturally at the head of the table there, with the windows at his back and the decanter before him. John Blackwood took pride in this table, his family, his position in the world. She had never even met him, Helen Clark said, and she looked angrily at Constance. I remember your father well. Faces fade away out of memory, I thought. I wondered if I would recognize Mrs. Wright if I saw her in the village. I wonder if Mrs. Wright in the village would walk past me not seeing. Perhaps Mrs. Wright was so timid that she never looked up at faces at all. Her cup of tea and her little rum cake sat on the table untouched. I, and I was a good friend of your mother's, Constance. That's why I feel able to speak to you so openly. For your own good, your mother would have wanted. My sister-in-law, who was, madam, a delicate woman, will have noticed her portrait in the drawing room and the exquisite line of the jawbone under the skin. A woman born for tragedy, perhaps, although inclined to be a little silly. On her right at this table, myself younger than, and not an invalid. I only have been helpless since that night. Across from me, the boy Thomas. Did you know I once had a nephew? That my brother had a son? Certainly. You have read about him. He was 10 years old and possessed many of his father's more forceful traits of nature. He used the most sugar, Mrs. Wright said. Alas, Uncle Julian said. Then, on the other side of my brother, my daughter Constance and my wife Dorothy, who had done me the honor of casting in her lot with mine, although I don't think she had anticipated anything so severe as arsenic on her blackberries. Another child, my niece, Mary Catherine, was not at the table. She was in her room, Mrs. Wright said. A great child of 12 sent to bed without supper. But she not need to concern us. I laughed, and Constance said to Helen Clark, Mary Cat was always in disgrace. I used to go up the back stairs with a tray of dinner for her after my father had left the dining room. She was a wicked, disobedient child. And she smiled at me. An unhealthy environment, Helen Clark said. A child should be punished for wrongdoing, but she should be made to feel that she's still loved. I would have never tolerated the child's wildness, and now we must. She began to put her gloves on again. Spring roasted lamb with a mint jelly made from Constance's garden mint. Spring potatoes, new peas, a salad again from Constance's garden. I remembered it perfectly, madam. It is still one of my favorite meals. I have also, of course, made a very thorough notes of everything about that meal. And in fact, that entire day, you will see at once how the dinner revolves around my niece. It was early summer. Her garden was doing well. The weather was lovely that year, I recall. I have not seen another summer since, or perhaps I'm getting older. We relied upon Constance for various small delicacies, which she could only provide. I am, of course, not referring to arsenic. Well, the blackberries were the important part. Mrs. Wright sounded a little hoarse. What a mind you have, madam. So precise, so unerring. I can see that you are going to ask me why she should conceivably have used arsenic. My niece is not capable of such subtleties. Her lawyer luckily said so at the trial. Constance can put her hand upon any bewildering array of deadly substances without ever leaving home. She could have fed you a sauce of poisoned hemlock, a member of the parsley family, which produces immediate paralysis and death when eaten. She might have made a marmalade of lovely thorn apple or a baneberry. She might have tossed a salad in Holcus lantus, or called velvet grass, and rich in hydrocyanic acid. I have notes on all of these, madam. Deadly nightshade is a relative of the tomato. We would, any of us, have had with prescience decline if Constance served it to us spiced and made into a pickle. Or consider it the mushroom family, rich as a tradition and deception. We were all fond of mushroom. My niece makes a mushroom omelet. You must taste to believe it, madam. And the common death cup. She should not have been doing the cooking, said Mrs. Wright strongly. Well, of course, there is the root of all of our trouble. Certainly, she should have not been doing the cooking, and her intention was to destroy all of us with poison. We would have been blindly unselfish to encourage her to cook under such circumstances. But she was acquitted, not of the deed, but of the intention. What was wrong with Mrs. Blackwood doing her own cooking? Please, Uncle Julian's voice said in a little shudder. I knew the gesture he was using with it, even though he was out of my sight. He would have risen one hand, finger spread. He'd be smiling at her um, over his ringers. It was gallant. Uncle Julian's gesture. I had seen him use it with Constance. I personally preferred to chance the arsenic. Uncle Julian said. We must go home, Helen Clark said. I don't know what's come over Lucille. I told her before we came not to mention the subject. I'm going to put wild strawberries up this year, Constance said to me. I noticed a considerable patch of them near the end of the garden. It's terribly tactless of her, and she keeps me waiting. The sugar bowl on the sideboard, the heavy silver sugar bowl. It was a family heirloom. My brother prized it highly. You'll be wondering about the sugar bowl, I imagine. Is it still in use? You are wondering. Has it been cleaned? You may very well ask, was it thoroughly washed? I can assure you at once. My niece Constance washed it before the doctor or the police had come. And you will allow it the flirtatious moment to wash a sugar bowl and scrub it with boiling water. And it was a curious act. There was a spider in it, Constance said to the teapot. We used a little rose-covered shoulder bowl for the lump tea for the sugar. There was a spider in it, she said. That's what she told the police. That's why she washed it. Well, Mrs. Wright said, it does seem like she might have had a better reason, even if there was a real spider. I mean, you don't wash. I mean, you take the spider out. What reason would you have given, madam? Well, I've never killed anybody, so I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I'd say. The first thing I came to my mind, I suppose. I mean, I'd suppose she'd been upset. I assure you that the pangs were fearful. You say you've never tasted arsenic? It's not agreeable. I'm extremely sorry for all of them. I myself lingered in great pain for several days. Constance would, I am sure, have demonstrated only the deepest sympathy for me. But by then, of course, she was largely unavailable. They arrested her at once. Mrs. Wright sounded more forceful and was unwillingly eager. I almost thought ever since they moved up here that it would be a wonderful chance to meet you people and really find out what happened, because of course there was always the one question that nobody has ever been able to answer. Of course, I hardly expect to talk to you about it, but look, there was the sound of the dining room chair being moved. Mrs. Wright had clearly decided to settle down. First, she said, she bought arsenic. To kill rats, Constance said to the teapot, and turned and smiled at me. To kill rats, Uncle Julian said. The only other popular use for arsenic is taxidermy, and my niece could hardly pretend to have a working knowledge of that subject. She cooked dinner and set the table. I confess I'm surprised at the woman, Helen Clark said. She seems such a quiet little body. It was Constance who saw them dying around like flies. I do beg your pardon. I never called the doctor, and never called the doctor until it was too late. And she washed the sugar bowl. There was a spider in it, Constance said. She told the police those people deserved to die. She was excited, madam. Perhaps the remark was misconstrued. My niece is not hard-hearted. Besides, she thought at the time that I was among them. And although I deserve to die, we all do we not? I hardly think that my niece is the one to point it out. She told the police that it was all her fault. Now there, Uncle Julian said, I think she made a mistake. I think certainly true. She thought at first that her cooking had caused all of this, but in taking full blame, I think she was overeager. I would have advised her against any such attitude had I been consulted. It smacks self-pity. But the great unanswered question is why? Why did she do it? I mean, unless we agree that Constance is a homicidal maniac. You have met her, madam. I have what? Oh my goodness, yes, I forgot. I can't seem to remember that pretty young girl is actually, well, a mass murderer must have reason, Mr. Blackwood, even if it were some perverted, twisted, dear, such a charming girl, your niece. I cannot remember when I've taken to anyone as I have to her. But if she's a homicidal maniac, I'm leaving. Helen Clark stood up and slammed her pocketbook empathetically under her arm. Lucille, she said, I'm leaving. We have overstayed all limits of decency. It's after 5 o'clock. Mrs. Wright scurried out of the dining room distraught. I'm so sorry, she said. We were chatting and I lost track of time. Oh dear. She ran to her chair to gather up her pocketbook. You haven't even touched your tea, I said, wanting to see her blush. Thank you, she said, and she looked down at her teacup and blushed. It was delicious. Uncle Julian stopped at his wheelchair in the center of the room and folded his hands happily before him. He looked at Constance and then raised his eyes and gazed at the corner of the ceiling, somber and demure. Julian, goodbye, Helen Clark said shortly. Constance, I'm sorry we stayed so long. It was inexcusable. Lucille. Mrs. Wright looked like a child who was going to be punished, and she had not forgotten her manners. Thank you, she said to Constance, putting out her hand and then taking it back again quickly. Had a very nice time. Goodbye, she said to Uncle Julian. They went into the hall, and I followed and locked the door after they had gone. Helen Clark started the car before poor Mrs. Wright had quite finished getting herself in, and the last I heard of Mrs. Wright was a little shriek of the car started down the driveway. I was laughing when I came back into the drawing room and went over and kissed Constance. A very nice tea party, I said. That impossible woman. Constance put her head back against the couch and laughed. I'll breed pretentious and stupid. Why she keeps coming, I'll never know. She wants to reform you. I took up Mrs. Wright's teacup and her rum cake and brought them over to the tea tray. Poor little Mrs. Wright, I said. You're teasing her, Mary Cat. A little bit, maybe. I couldn't help it when people are frightened. I always want to frighten them more. Constance, um, Uncle Julian turned his wheelchair to face her. How was I? Superb, Uncle Julian. Constance stood up and went over to them and touched his old head lightly. You didn't need your notes at all. It really happened? He asked her. It certainly did. I'll take you into your room and you can look at your newspaper clippings. I think not right now. It's been a superlative afternoon and I think I'm a little tired. I will rest until dinner. Constance pushed the wheelchair down the hall and I followed him with the tea tray. I was allowed to carry dirty dishes, but not to wash them up. So I set the tray on the kitchen table and watched while Constance stacked the dishes by the sink to wash later, and swept up the broken milk pitcher on the floor and took out potatoes to start for dinner. Finally, I asked her. The thought had been chilling me all afternoon. Are you going to do what she said? I asked her. What Helen Clark said? She did not pretend not to understand. She stood there looking at her hands working and smiled a little. I don't know, she said.